The rain was still falling when the lawyer slid the document across the table. It was a Tuesday in late October. The office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. I had driven 2 hours to get there. My cousins, Daniel and Victor, had arrived early and were already settled in their chairs like men who knew exactly how the afternoon was going to end. The lawyer, a thin, careful man named Mr. Aldrich, read the will slowly. My uncle Raymond had left behind a modest estate. The house, the savings, the farm equipment, all of it went to Daniel and Victor. I had expected that. Raymond and I were close, but old family guilt had shaped his choices over the years. What I had not expected was the land. Raymond had left me a parcel 40 miles east of town, 12 acres, mostly flat, with a dry creek along the southern edge. It wasn't worth a fortune, but it was something real, the last physical piece of a family slowly fading into memory. I was still studying the map when Daniel leaned back and smiled. "The access road," he said, tapping the page. "That's ours now." I looked up. He was already watching me, calm and satisfied. "You can keep the dirt," he added, "if you can reach it." They both laughed. Mr. Aldrich said nothing. And just like that, I understood exactly what they had done. I didn't move. I sat very still while Daniel and Victor gathered their papers and shook Mr. Aldrich's hand. Their voices were light, almost cheerful. Victor made a comment about going for dinner to celebrate. Daniel laughed. Mr. Aldrich smiled politely at his desk. I kept looking at the map. It was clean, simple, and devastating. My 12 acres sat in the middle of the page like a small island. The only road leading to it, a gravel track that had existed for decades, now belonged to my cousins. Legally, completely, without any obligation to let me pass. I was 58 years old. I had buried my wife, Patricia, 8 months earlier after a short illness that moved faster than either of us was ready for. I had barely finished grieving before Raymond passed. And now I was watching the last piece of my family's legacy get walled off while 2 men I had grown up with made dinner plans and called it a good day. Before they walked out, I heard Victor lean toward Daniel and say something quietly. I caught only 4 words. "He won't fight it." I didn't argue. I didn't respond. I didn't look up from the map. But something inside me went very still in a way that had nothing to do with giving up. My name is Harold Brennan. I am 58 years old. And for most of my adult life, I have been a civil engineer specializing in infrastructure development. I spent 30 years designing roads, real ones, highways, county routes, private access drives, utility corridors. I have worked with zoning boards, land surveyors, environmental agencies, and local councils in 4 states. I know how land is measured, how access is defined under the law, and, more importantly, how it can be denied and then carefully reclaimed. My cousins didn't know any of that. To them, I was just Raymond's quiet nephew, the one who showed up at family gatherings with a bottle of wine and didn't talk much, the one who had cried openly at Patricia's funeral while they stood at a respectful distance. To them, I was tired and easy to walk around. They weren't entirely wrong about the tired part, but Raymond understood who I was. He used to say I was the only person in the family who could look at empty land and see what it was capable of becoming. He left me those 12 acres with purpose, not because they were the most valuable thing he owned, but because he believed I was the only one who would do something real with them. He wasn't wrong about that. I didn't sleep that night. I drove home through the rain with the copies from Mr. Aldrich spread across my passenger seat. When I got home, I cleared the kitchen table, laid everything flat under the overhead light, and started reading. The legal documents were tight. Daniel and Victor had prepared carefully. The access road had been quietly reclassified from shared family right-of-way into a private parcel roughly 2 years before Raymond died. Someone had been planning this for a while. As I worked through the boundary maps, something bothered me. I've spent decades reading survey documents. I know what careful paperwork looks like, and I know what rushed paperwork looks like. This was rushed. The boundaries were drawn wide and confident, the kind of lines drawn by someone focused on the main prize and no longer watching the edges. At the far eastern edge of my land, where the property line met an old county boundary marker, there was a thin strip of ground, maybe 15 feet wide, perhaps 80 feet long. Unremarkable, almost invisible. It hadn't been included in anything my cousins had acquired. I traced the line twice to be certain. I checked the boundary coordinates 3 separate times. They had missed it. I set my pencil down and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Victor. I didn't go back to Mr. Aldrich's office. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table until the first gray light of morning came through the window, and then I made one call. Roy Simmons had been a licensed land surveyor for over 20 years. We had worked together on a county highway expansion project in my mid-40s and stayed loosely in touch since. He was precise, thorough, and slow to speak unless he was certain. He also owed me a professional favor that I had never called in. When he picked up, his voice was still rough with early morning. "Roy," I said, "I need to know exactly what someone missed." A brief silence. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough that I need to understand my options before I tell anyone I'm looking for them." "Send me the documents," he said. I photographed everything. The original parcel maps, boundary surveys, Raymond's deed, the reclassification paperwork, and sent the files before 8 in the morning. Then I made coffee, sat back down at the table, and waited. The house was very quiet. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world looked washed clean in a way it often doesn't. Roy called me back on Thursday afternoon. I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee I had stopped tasting, watching a pair of crows argue over something at the fence line. When my phone rang and I saw his name, I answered on the first ring. "Harold," he said, "that strip is real." He walked me through it carefully. The 15-foot parcel along my eastern edge was a remnant from a county infrastructure survey done in the 1970s. A right-of-way corridor set aside for future road development and then abandoned when the county changed its plans. It had never been absorbed into private ownership. It remained on the official books as a county easement corridor, unactivated but legally documented. At its far northern end, it connected to a decommissioned gravel track the county had taken off its maintenance list 22 years ago. That track still existed on paper. "It's not much," Roy said. "You need to build to reach it. Not cheap and not fast." "I know," I told him. There was a pause. "You're not thinking about selling," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," I said. "Good," he replied. "Because I don't think you should." For the first time since that afternoon in Mr. Aldrich's office, I felt something other than grief. A week after Roy's call, I drove out to see both parcels. I told myself it was a preliminary site review, the professional term for what I was doing. Look at the terrain, understand the drainage, note the access points, identify the obstacles. That's what I would have called it in any working setting. But honestly, I needed to see it with my own eyes. My cousins were already moving. A contractor had placed orange survey stakes every 20 feet along their northern boundary. A small excavator was clearing brush near the old tree line. Someone had set up a white portable site office close to the road, the kind of structure that signals serious construction plans. They were building fast, confidently, like men who had already won. As I drove slowly along the county road bordering my property's western edge, a figure near the excavator looked up and saw me parked on the shoulder. He raised one hand in a slow, mocking wave, the kind that isn't a greeting at all. I raised my hand back, calm and unhurried. Then I continued driving, noting the slope of the land, the position of their stakes, the direction their planned driveway was angled. All of it useful. All of it filed carefully in the part of my mind that had been engineering for 3 decades. They thought I had no options. They had no idea what I'd already found. I went to the county planning office the following Monday. I dressed the way I used to dress for client meetings, dark trousers, a clean collared shirt, my good shoes. I brought Roy's initial survey notes, the parcel maps, and a 1-page summary I had typed up the night before. The woman at the front counter was polite and efficient. She reviewed my documents, disappeared through a back door, and returned 10 minutes later with a man named Mr. Gould, who introduced himself as a senior planning coordinator. He went through everything carefully, then removed his glasses. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "developing access through that easement corridor will be costly and complex. The environmental review process alone could take 18 months, and the county isn't in a position to fund private access improvements." "I'm not asking the county to fund anything," I said. "I'm asking what the formal process requires. He paused. You want a complete list? A complete list? I confirmed. He brought me one. Permits, environmental assessments, grading approvals, utility routing studies, public notice periods. It was long and expensive. I thanked him, took my copies, and walked outside. I hadn't come for permission. I had come to understand exactly what the path looked like. Now I knew. Martin Hale answered on the third ring. We had worked together on a mixed-use development in the mid-2000s that had nearly fallen apart twice before we pushed it across the finish line. Martin was a developer who treated problems as negotiations and negotiations as sport. He was methodical, well-connected, and had contact across 3 counties. He also owed me something significant. 15 years ago, I had caught a critical drainage error in one of his plans, a mistake that would have flooded 3 adjacent properties within 5 years. I flagged it quietly, gave him time to correct it, and never mentioned it to the municipal board. He had never forgotten. Harold, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. It's been a long time. It has, I agreed. I have something I'd like you to look at. What kind of something? The kind that looks like a problem and might actually be an opportunity, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Send me what you have. I'll look at it tonight. I sent him Roy's survey data, the parcel maps, the county planning notes, and a rough sketch of what I was beginning to imagine. He called me the next morning at 7:15. When can we meet? He said. We met at a diner midway between our homes on a Wednesday morning. Martin arrived with a laptop and a legal pad covered in notes. He ordered black coffee and barely touched it. He spread my documents on the table and went through everything methodically, pointing at numbers, asking precise questions, referencing county zoning rules from memory. I answered each one. This was the language I'd spoken for 30 years, and it felt good to use it again after months of grief and silence. After about 40 minutes, he leaned back. You came here thinking about access, he said. That's what I need, I agreed. That's too small. He tapped the map. Look at what surrounds your parcel. Undeveloped county land to the north, the easement corridor on the east, your cousin's property on the west and south. If we acquire 2 or 3 northern parcels, we don't just solve your access problem, we build something. A development, I said. Residential. 20 to 30 homes at full build-out. Proper streets, utilities, green space. The numbers work if we bring in the right investors. I looked at the map for a long moment. It had started as a thin strip of overlooked ground on a survey document. Then let's make the numbers work, I said. The next 6 months were the busiest of my retirement. Martin brought in 2 investors, careful, precise men named Farrell and Okafor, who asked direct questions and committed funds once satisfied. I handled the technical side, environmental assessments, soil reports, grading plans, utility routing studies. I wrote documents I hadn't written in years, and the work came back quickly, like a language you never fully lose. The county easement corridor was the foundation. Roy worked with a land attorney named Ms. Fitch to file the necessary paperwork for formal recognition of the access right-of-way. The process was slow, certified letters, public notices, waiting periods, but every step was clean and properly documented. Meanwhile, Martin quietly acquired 2 parcels north of my land through a holding company he had used before. Neither purchase drew attention. Neither seller knew what the land would become. Permits came in stages: grading approval, environmental clearance, preliminary subdivision review. Each one required another round of forms and fees and follow-up calls. My cousins were 2 miles away, building with full confidence on their inherited land, completely unaware that every approval I secured was quietly redrawing the geography around them. I didn't mention any of it to anyone outside our small group. There was no reason to. Not yet. The first rumor reached me through a man named Pete Waller. Pete ran a construction supply company in town and had sold materials to contractors across the county for decades. I had placed a modest order through his business, gravel and pipe sections for the initial access road grading. And apparently, that was enough to start people talking. He called on a Friday afternoon, cheerful and openly curious, which was simply Pete's way. Harold, he said, I'm hearing your name connected to something big out east of town. Survey crews on multiple parcels. Word is, I'm improving my property. I told him. Sure. Only someone told someone who told me it's infrastructure level work. Real activity. People notice construction, I said. He laughed. They do. Anyway, if you need materials, you know where I am. I thanked him and ended the call. The rumor didn't concern me. Some local talk was unavoidable once bulldozers appeared. What I cared about was one specific question. Had the rumor reached Daniel and Victor yet? Based on what Pete had described, I suspected it had. They would be curious, possibly unsettled, but not yet worried enough to act. I figured I had a few more weeks before that changed. It took 3 more weeks. I was at the hardware store on Saturday morning, picking up marking paint and cable staples, when I heard my name from the next aisle. I turned the corner and found Daniel standing there with a box of deck screws, wearing the carefully relaxed expression of a man who had been thinking hard about something for several days. "Harold," he said, "what are you building out there?" I set a second can of paint in my basket before answering. "Improving my property," I said. "I heard you had survey crews working. Multiple teams." His voice was even, but his eyes weren't. Behind the casual tone was something watchful. The first sign that his confidence had developed a small, uncomfortable crack. "Survey work is standard when you're planning site improvements," I said pleasantly. "Planning site improvements," he repeated slowly. "That's right." He looked at me for a moment. I held his gaze without any particular expression. "Well," he said finally, just curious, "you know how neighbors are." "I do," I said. I paid for my materials, said goodbye to the woman at the register by name, and walked out into the cool morning air. Daniel was still in the store when I left. I didn't look back. Construction began on a Monday in early spring. The ground had finally thawed enough to grade properly, and the forecast was clear for 2 weeks. I was on site at 7 in the morning when the first bulldozer came off the flatbed with a low, steady rumble. Roy had staked the access corridor with precision. Every marker was exact, every elevation calculated twice. The route followed the eastern edge of my property along the county easement corridor as it curved north toward the decommissioned gravel track. Not a straight line, but legal, documented, and entirely ours. We weren't advertising it, but you cannot hide a bulldozer. By mid-morning, a white truck had slowed on the county road to the west, the road that passed my cousin's property. It sat on the shoulder for several minutes before pulling away. An hour later, it came back slower. That afternoon, I recognized Daniel's gray pickup. It passed twice at reduced speed, the driver studying the grading work and the survey stakes. They couldn't come onto my land without cause. All they could do was drive by and watch the gravel being laid and the grade taking shape and try to understand what they were looking at. I was fairly certain they couldn't piece it together yet, but they were starting to try, and that was a different problem than not knowing. The county infrastructure notice arrived 6 weeks into construction. It came by certified mail, the kind of document you open carefully and read more than once. I sat at the kitchen table with my morning coffee and read it 3 times. Our development had been formally designated as a connected residential project, eligible to integrate with the county's updated infrastructure plan for the Eastern District. The county would extend a utility corridor and secondary road network into the eastern area as part of their regional expansion. Because our project was already permitted and under construction, we would serve as the anchor point. In plain terms, our land had gone from being isolated at the edge of the map to being the center of the county's eastern growth zone. I called Martin immediately and read him the relevant paragraph over the phone. He was quiet for a moment. "Harold," he said carefully, "do you understand what this does to their position?" I did. Once the county locked its infrastructure to our development, my cousin's property would no longer sit at the entrance to a growing area. It would sit at the margin of one. Their planned development value, their road access, their future appeal to buyers, all of it had quietly shifted. Their land hadn't moved, but everything around it had. They called on a Thursday evening in late April. Daniel's name appeared on my screen. I let it ring once before answering. "Harold," he said. "Daniel," I replied. His voice had changed since the hardware store. The lightness was gone. What replaced it was something measured and careful. The voice of a man who has been studying maps for days and hasn't liked what he's found. "I wanted to check in," he said. "See how things are coming along." I'm hearing it's getting fairly substantial out there. It's moving on schedule, I said. What exactly are you building? A residential development, I said. Permitted, approved, and under active construction. A pause. Victor and I were thinking we should sit down. Talk through how this affects the neighboring properties. As family. The word family arrived carefully, like something he had rehearsed. I'm happy to sit down when the timing works, I said. Right now my schedule is full. Of course, he said quickly. Just keep us in a loop, would you? I'll be in touch, I said. I ended the call and set the phone on the counter. They had been looking at the maps. They had noticed things. They weren't certain yet about what they were seeing, but they were very close to understanding it. The detail that changed everything had been sitting in the county records the entire time. I found it during a routine review of the updated parcel maps following the county's infrastructure designation. It wasn't something I had originally planned for. It surfaced when the county redrew the routing lines around our development. Daniel and Victor's main access road, the wide gravel track connecting their property to the county highway, crossed the midpoint of a small parcel. That parcel had belonged to an elderly man named Mr. Creedy, who had passed away the previous winter with no direct heirs. His estate had gone through probate and the land had been listed through an estate agent. Martin had purchased it 4 months earlier for a price that reflected what it appeared to be, undeveloped land with modest value. Neither of us had realized, at the time, that my cousin's road ran directly through it. We had bought it because it connected to the northern boundary of our development plan. But the updated county maps made it unmistakable. Their road, our parcel. I called Martin that night and told him what I had found. He was quiet for several long seconds. When he spoke, his voice was slow and deliberate. Harold, he said, I think it's time to let them figure this out for themselves. I agreed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning by certified mail. The return address was a law firm from the next county, not Mr. Aldrich. Someone new. Some of my cousins had hired specifically for this. It was 3 pages of careful legal language, but the core was simple. A formal request for clarification of the ownership and intended use of the parcel currently registered under Hale Brennan Properties LLC, specifically the portion intersecting with the established access route serving the estate property to the west. In plain language, they had figured it out. Their road ran through our land. They had no legal easement, and they knew it. I scanned the letter and sent copies to Martin and Ms. Fitch that same morning. Ms. Fitch called that afternoon. Their position is weak, she said, without preamble. The parcel was legally acquired. There is no recorded easement, no historical right-of-way filing, no agreement of any kind. They have been using that road purely by assumption. So we have no obligation to them, I said. None. You can permit access, restrict it, or negotiate terms. That choice belongs entirely to you. I thanked her and sat with that for a long while. 18 months ago, they had come to that lawyer's office holding all the power. Now, they were writing formal letters, asking permission. I arranged the meeting myself. I called Daniel directly, kept it brief, and told him I was ready to sit down. I suggested a conference room at a local business center in town. Neutral ground, professional, no associations with either side. They arrived together, Daniel in his gray pickup, Victor following in a dark blue sedan. Their lawyer, a compact and serious man named Mr. Birch, walked in beside them. They wore good clothes, like men preparing for something they were not sure how to handle. I came with Martin and Ms. Fitch. I had prepared printed maps and a clear summary document. I walked them through everything methodically. The county infrastructure designation, the updated parcel boundaries, the development plan, the approved access corridor. Then I placed the final map on the table, the one showing their road running across the blue outline boundary of our parcel. The room went completely quiet. Victor stared at it, then at Daniel, then back at the map. Mr. Birch leaned forward and studied the boundary lines for nearly a full minute without speaking. I said nothing. The map did the work. Finally, Daniel looked up. The unshakable certainty I had watched him carry since Mr. Aldrich's office was simply gone. "What do you want, Harold?" he asked. His voice was flat and careful. I looked at him calmly. "I'll be in touch," I said. I didn't answer on the drive home. I thought about Daniel's face when he looked up from that map. The stillness of a man who has understood something he cannot undo. I thought about Victor sitting beside him, quieter than I had ever seen him. I pulled into my driveway, sat in the car for a while, and let myself feel the weight of it. Not the satisfaction, the weight. Because what I was holding, the legal access to their road, the power to approve or deny, was the same kind of power they had used against me in that lawyer's office 18 months ago. And I knew exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that. I didn't want to use it the way they had. I thought about Raymond. He was a practical man who believed that disputes should end with terms both sides could live within, not terms designed to punish. He had left me those 12 acres because he trusted my judgment as a person, not just as an engineer. I wasn't going to waste that trust on something small or bitter. I went inside, made dinner, and sat at the kitchen table with a blank legal pad. It was time to decide what I actually wanted, not what would wound them most, but what I could live with for the rest of my life. I spent 3 evenings working through it. Not what would cost them the most, what would be fair, lasting, and something I could respect myself for when it was all behind me. Martin's instinct was to charge a significant annual access fee, with a clause allowing revocation under defined conditions. Ms. Fitch drafted that framework on Tuesday and sent it over. It was legally solid and would give us considerable ongoing leverage. I read it twice. Then I set it aside. I thought about Raymond. He used to say that the purpose of a good agreement is not to give one side power over the other. It's to make the terms so clear that power never needs to be exercised. What I wanted was straightforward. A permanent, documented easement. Access that was real, recorded, and beyond future dispute. A one-time payment reflecting fair market value, established from comparable county records. A clause protecting our development from interference, written plainly. And one final condition, an acknowledgement, on the record, that they had used that road without legal right. Not an apology, just a fact. I called Martin and explained what I was thinking. That's more reasonable than they deserve, he said. Maybe, I agreed, but it's what I can live with. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said, let's write it up. The second meeting was 2 weeks later. I arrived with a contract package 22 pages long, prepared by Ms. Fitch and reviewed carefully by Martin. The terms were specific and clear. Daniel and Victor would receive a permanent, documented access easement across the relevant parcel. The easement covered their road exactly as it existed, 24 feet wide, with a right to maintain it at their own expense. The grant was permanent, tied to their deed, so any future owner would hold the same right. In exchange, they would make a one-time payment reflecting the established fair market value of an easement of that size and duration in the county. Ms. Fitch had pulled verified comparable transactions from county records to set the number. Not punishing, but real. The easement also included a non-interference clause. They could not challenge our development, obstruct our permitted access corridor, or file complaints against our construction activity. Those terms were written plainly. And the final condition, a written acknowledgement that their road had been used for 18 months without a legal easement on record. Not an apology, just the truth, on paper, witnessed, and properly filed. I set the package on the table and looked across at them. Take your time, I said. It took 12 days. Mr. Birch pushed back on 3 clauses. Ms. Fitch responded to each in writing, with precise legal references. 2 of his objections were withdrawn within 24 hours. The third, a request to soften the language in the acknowledgement clause, was declined without negotiation. That clause stayed exactly as written. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, Ms. Fitch called while I was making dinner. It's done, she said. Signed, notarized, and filed with the county recorder's office this morning. I set down the spoon I was holding. All of it, I asked. Every page, including the acknowledgement. I thanked her. She paused before hanging up. Harold, she said, for what it's worth, this is one of the cleaner outcomes I've seen. You had room to make this much harder for them. I know, I said. Why didn't you? I thought about it for a moment. Because I didn't want the rest of my life organized around what they did to me, I said. She was quiet for a moment. That's a good reason, she said softly. I finished making dinner, ate slowly, and then went out to the back porch and sat in the warm evening air. It was the most peaceful I had felt since Patricia died. By the following autumn, the development was alive. Not just on paper, actually physically alive. Streets with names. Utility lines running underground. Foundation slabs curing in the October sun. The first 3 homes have been framed by mid-month, and purchase agreements signed on 6 more. The access road, the one that had started as a thin strip of overlooked ground on a decades-old survey document, was now a proper graded road with drainage channels on both sides and a solid surface that would eventually be paved. The county had connected its utility corridor to our infrastructure right on schedule. Martin organized a small gathering at the site on a Saturday afternoon. Nothing formal, just the investors, the construction crew, and several families who had already signed on. Someone brought food. Children ran across the open ground between the framing stakes, not knowing or caring what any of it had cost to build. I stood near the edge of the road and looked out over all of it. 12 months ago, this had been 12 landlocked acres and a closed door. Now it was something people were going to live their lives inside. Families would grow in these houses. Children would ride bikes on these streets. None of them would ever know what it took to build them. That suited me perfectly. The road opened officially on a Friday morning in November. I drove out alone, before the crew arrived and before any new residents were about. I parked at the southern entrance, where the county road met the development's main street, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The sky was pale and very clear, the kind of autumn sky that makes everything look sharper than usual. The road stretched north through the development, quiet and still, the gravel surface bright with overnight frost. Soon it would carry people with groceries, with children in the back seat, with ordinary places they needed to be. They would drive it without thinking, the way people always drive a well-built road, without thinking about the person who designed it. I was still standing there when Daniel's gray pickup came along the county road from the west and slowed near the entrance. He didn't stop. He looked at the road, and then he looked at me. I nodded once. He nodded back. Then he drove on and was gone around the bend. No smirk, no wave, no words, just a nod from one person to another. I stood there a little while longer. I thought about Raymond, and about Patricia, and about that afternoon in Mr. Aldrich's office when something inside me had gone very still. I walked back to my car. I drove home.